The storm came in hard from the northwest, the way the worst ones always did in Black Hollow, without apology and without warning, just a sudden drop in pressure that the old-timers could feel in their knees 2 hours before the sky turned the color of a bruise, and then the full weight of November coming down at once. By 7 in the evening, Route 9 was a river of black ice and dead leaves. The highway lights had been flickering since 6, and the population of Black Hollow, which had never been impressive even on its best days, had retreated entirely behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the way small towns do when the weather turns mean, and there is nothing left to prove by staying out in it. Harlan's Diner sat at the junction of Route 9 and County Road 14, like something that had been forgotten and was fine with that. The sign above the door was missing 2 letters and had been for going on 9 years. The pie case on the counter held 3 slices of something that might have been apple and hadn't been touched since noon. The jukebox in the corner hadn't worked since the second Bush administration, but nobody had bothered to unplug it. And on slow nights, the dead machine gave off a faint electrical hum like a ghost that didn't know it was supposed to have moved on. Willa had been working the counter since 5. She was 53 years old and had worked this counter or one very much like it for most of her adult life, and she had long since developed the skill of a woman who reads rooms for a living, the ability to assess the weight of any given group of people in the first 30 seconds after they walked through her door and to calibrate everything that followed accordingly. The 4 men had come in around 6 one by one, the way they always did when they were passing through Black Hollow, which wasn't often and never by announcement. 4 men in leather with road dust on their boots and a silence around them that had weight and specific intent, the kind that told Willa everything she needed to know and nothing she particularly wanted to. She'd refilled their coffee 3 times without being asked. She hadn't attempted conversation. She kept the diner open past the point where she would have closed it on any other night because they were there and they hadn't indicated they were leaving. And there was something about men like that, the weight of their presence, the way their eyes tracked the door every time the wind rattled it in its frame, that made you reluctant to suggest they do anything at all. The booth was meant for 4. It fit 4 badly. The man at the inside corner of the bench seat was the one Willa's eyes kept returning to, the way your tongue keeps returning to a sore tooth. Not because you want to, but because there is something unresolved about it that won't leave you alone. Holt Kane was 41 years old and looked like he'd lived 2 of them. He wasn't the biggest man in the booth. That was Briggs Drum, who was 6'4" and built like a highway barrier and about as conversational. He wasn't the most visibly marked. That was Reagan Falk, who had a scar that started below his left ear and ended somewhere under his collar and eyes, that never fully settled on any single point for long. He wasn't the youngest. That was Levi Cord, 29, who looked younger in the face and older in every other way that counted. But Holt was the one you watched. Holt was the one the other 3 watched, even when they were pretending not to. He had that quality that certain men carry, not authority exactly, more like gravity, like the room tilted very slightly in his direction, without anyone deciding it should. He was staring at his coffee, had been for most of the last hour. The coffee had gone cold a long time ago, but he hadn't asked for a refill and hadn't pushed the cup away, just held it with both hands, like it was the only warm thing available, which by now it wasn't. The burn scar on his left forearm ran from his wrist to just below his elbow. The skin there had a pale gathered texture, tight in cold weather, always tight in cold weather, that he'd stopped covering up around year 10. Because covering it up meant thinking about it every morning when he dressed, and thinking about it every morning meant starting every day in the same place. And he had decided somewhere around year 10 that he was done starting every day in the same place. He hadn't been entirely, but he'd stopped covering the scar. Reagan had his phone on the table and wasn't looking at it. Briggs was watching the window, the storm making the glass shudder in its frame every few minutes like something outside wanted in. Levi had his arms folded on the table and his chin down, the restless half-sleep of a man who had learned to take what his body would give and not complain about the quality of it. Nobody was talking. They'd been riding together for 6 years and had long since passed the point where silence needed to be filled. Their cuts, black leather, the iron compass patch on the back, the chapter rocker reading Nowhere USA. which was a joke that had stopped being funny somewhere around year 3 and started being accurate, hung on the hooks by the booth like they'd always lived there. Outside, the storm hit the windows again. Harder this time. Briggs said without turning his head, "Power's going to go." Holt said nothing. Reagan said, "Already did on the east side. Saw the line go dark coming in off the highway." Levi lifted his chin enough to look at the window, registered what he saw, and put it back down. That was the full extent of the conversation for the next 20 minutes. The door opened at 7:42. Willa's head came up from behind the counter. The cold came in first, a hard cutting edge of November air that made the paper napkins on the counter lift and resettle. And then the girl. She was small. She was soaked through jacket, jeans, sneakers that left dark, wet prints on the linoleum with every step. Her hair was plastered to her face in dark ropes, and she was clutching something to her chest with both arms, a stuffed rabbit so thoroughly wet that it had lost whatever shape it had originally possessed, and was now just a gray, sodden mass of fabric that she held like it was the most important object in the world. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not hesitating, Willa thought afterward, not uncertain, just orienting herself the way a compass needle orients, like she was looking for something specific and was taking the half-second required to locate it. Then her eyes found the back booth, and she walked. Willa started to come around the counter. "Honey, did someone bring you? Are you okay?" The girl didn't look at her. She walked the length of the diner with her wet sneakers, leaving dark prints on the floor, and she stopped at the end of the table, and she looked up at Holt Kane with eyes that Willa would struggle for days afterward to describe accurately. Not frightened, that wasn't it. Not the eyes of a lost child, or a scared child, or a child in the ordinary distress of being somewhere unfamiliar and alone. These were the eyes of someone who had already been frightened past the point where frightened was useful and had come out the other side into something harder and more purposeful. Like fear had been a tool she'd used and set down when she was done with it. She said, "Do you make bad people go away?" The booth went absolutely still. Even Briggs stopped watching the window. Holt looked at the girl for a long moment. Then he set his coffee cup down very carefully, like he was buying himself a few seconds for something internal to finish settling. His face did not change in any dramatic way, but something behind his eyes went very quiet and very certain in a way that was different from the quiet and certain he'd been sitting in for the past 2 hours. "What's your name?" he said. His voice was low and level, not soft exactly, because Holt's voice didn't do soft, but without edges on it either, which was notable. "Della," she said. "Della Cross." "Okay, Della Cross." He shifted in the booth, angling his body toward her, without making any move to stand, without reaching for her, the deliberate body language of a large man who has learned that his size reads as threat and is careful about it. "How did you get here?" "I ran." "From where?" "Home." "Where's home?" "Cedar Lane." She said it the way you say an address when you expect the address to explain something like the street name itself carried information that words couldn't fully carry. Holt looked at Reagan. Reagan was already on his phone pulling something up. He turned the screen so Holt could see it. Cedar Lane was a dead-end residential street about a mile and a half northeast, through the edge of the storm, through 2 unlit stretches of empty road, through a stretch of woods along the creek. A mile and a half and 7 degrees above zero, in a storm that had taken down 2 pine trees on Route 9 before 6 o'clock. In wet sneakers, in whatever jacket she was wearing that had clearly done very little to keep the cold out. Holt looked back at Della. "Who told you to run?" "My mom," she said. "She told me run and don't stop and find someone safe." A pause, the wet rabbit dripped on the floor. "I saw your motorcycles outside." Something moved across Holt's face, a complicated thing too fast to read entirely and too private to try. Willa caught the edge of it from behind the counter and looked away. There was something in it that felt like it belonged only to him. "You thought we were safe," Holt said. It came out almost like a question. "Mom always says if you need real help, you find someone who already knows how bad things can get." Della met his eyes without looking away. "You look like you know." Reagan set his phone down on the table. Briggs had turned fully from the window. Levi was upright now, both hands flat on the table, watching the girl with the focused attention of someone who has just recalibrated what kind of moment he's in. Holt said, "Tell me what's happening at your house." She told him. It came out in fragments, the way children tell things non-linear. Some details too large and some too small. The full picture assembled through inference and the spaces between facts. Her mother's name was June. June Cross. June's ex-boyfriend had come back tonight. His name was Roy Dent. She said the name the way you say a word that has a bad taste built into it. She'd known from the second he knocked that this visit was different from the other ones. Something in the way her mother's body changed when she opened the door and saw who it was. Something in how quietly her mother said, "Go to your room, baby," the word baby at the end, carrying a whole other meaning underneath the surface of it. She'd heard things through her bedroom door, things breaking, her mother's voice going from words to just sound, not words anymore. Just the sound underneath words, the part that exists before language. And Roy's voice underneath all of it, low and flat and constant. The kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud to fill a room entirely. And then her mother's voice close to the bedroom door, barely above a whisper. "Baby, listen." The window. Cedar Creek Trail through the woods. Harlan's Diner on Route 9. Run and don't stop and find someone. She'd taken the rabbit because the rabbit was what she always took. By the time she finished, she was sitting in the booth. Reagan had gotten up without announcement and given her a seat. Willa had produced coffee creamer and a handful of sugar packets in lieu of hot chocolate. The hot chocolate mix was somewhere in the back room, and she hadn't wanted to leave the counter long enough to find it, and Della was holding the sugar packets in both hands, like she wasn't entirely sure what they were. The four men were standing in a loose arrangement around the table, not looking at each other, all of them looking at her. Holt said, "Willa." "Yeah." She'd been listening from the counter. She wasn't pretending otherwise. "You got anything warm in the back blanket? Something like that?" "I'll find something." "And call 911. Tell them there's a domestic situation at—" He looked at Reagan. 14 Cedar Lane, Reagan said. "Active situation victim still on premises." Holt looked back at Della. "Your mom was still in the house when you left?" "Yes." "She tell you to call anyone, any family you could go to?" Della shook her head once. "It's just us." Holt absorbed that. Let it settle completely before he moved on. Willa had come around with a fleece blanket from the back room, not much but dry, and Della let it be draped around her shoulders without taking her eyes off Holt. The wet rabbit sat in her lap, still dripping slowly onto the seat. "Okay," Holt said. He said it with the flatness of a man closing a door on internal deliberation. "You did right. You did exactly right. You're safe here." He said it simply without performance. "We're going to take care of the rest." Della looked at him for a moment with those careful, too-old eyes. Then she looked down at the rabbit and said almost to herself, "I knew." Holt stood. He turned toward Reagan, and his face did the thing it did when something internal dropped to a lower, stiller temperature. Not colder exactly, more like settled. Like the thing that moved behind his eyes had stopped moving and become something certain and quiet and done deliberating. Reagan said, "Already dressed," meaning the bikes, meaning the road, meaning he'd been tracking this from the moment the girl walked in. Briggs had his jacket off the hook and was moving to the door with the economy of a very large man who has learned that economy of movement is its own kind of power. Levi was right behind him. There was nothing hurried about any of it. No urgency in the physical movements. Just the efficiency of men who have learned that urgency costs you precision, and precision is what the situation in front of you actually requires. They moved with the calm certainty of water finding its level. Holt pulled on his cut and paused with his hand on the door. He looked back at Della in the booth. She was watching him, the blanket around her shoulders, the rabbit in her lap, one sugar packet still held loosely in her hand. "Don't go anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. He pushed through the door into the storm. Cedar Lane was a mile and a half by road. Tighter through the creek trail that Della had used, but on bikes that route wasn't navigable. On a dry November night, the road distance was nothing, 5 minutes, maybe 6. On this night, with the black ice on Route 9 and the crosswind coming in hard off the flat land, trying to push them into the center line every 100 yards, it was longer than that. Holt led, Briggs on his left and slightly behind, Reagan and Levi taking the rear. The diamond formation they defaulted to on bad roads, each man covering the other's blind spots, the same way they'd ridden through worse than this, in worse places than this. The cold was absolute, the kind that doesn't care about your leather jacket. It finds the gaps at your wrists, at your collar, at the base of your neck, and it makes itself at home and stays. Holt had ridden in Montana and in northern Michigan in February, and once across a stretch of South Dakota in conditions that had made this look like early fall. He'd long since stopped registering cold as something that deserved complaint. He registered it tonight. He registered it because Delacrosse had run this same distance in wet sneakers and a jacket that was doing very little for anyone a mile and a half of this in the dark, because her mother had whispered through a bedroom door, and she had understood what the whisper meant and had done what the whisper asked. He thought about what kind of 8-year-old that required. What kind of life produced that? The history that teaches a child to move fast and quietly through the dark towards something specific and not fall apart on the way. He registered a lot of things in the 7 minutes it took to reach Cedar Lane. He registered that he'd been sitting in that diner booth for almost 2 hours with nowhere he was going and no particular reason to be going there. Just the general restless weight of being Holt Kane in a world that kept placing rooms in front of him that needed something he was trying not to be. He registered that the last time someone had looked at him with that quality of need, not pleading, not desperate, just certain, the way a compass needle is certain, he had been 23 years old and in turnout gear, and there had been a face in a second-floor window that he had not reached in time. He registered that he had spent 18 years constructing a life that kept him moving so that he never again had to be the answer to that kind of question. And then an 8-year-old girl in wet sneakers had walked through a storm specifically to find him. 14 Cedar Lane was a small house at the end of a cul-de-sac ranch style, the kind of house that tried hard and showed the trying. Flower boxes under the windows with the last of something still in them, brown and frost-killed but still standing. A wreath on the front door that had blown sideways in the storm. A child's bicycle on the porch leaned against the siding at an angle that said it had been there since the weather turned cold and hadn't been moved since. The lights were on inside. The front door was closed. Holt killed his engine at the mouth of the cul-de-sac. The other 3 stopped behind him. For a moment, the only sound was the storm and the ticking of cooling metal. He could hear something from inside the house. Not words, just sound. The wrong kind of sound for a house where someone was simply home on a November night. He was off the bike in one motion, at the front door in 2. The knock he put on it wasn't a question, it was a statement. Silence from inside. The sound he'd heard stopped. Then footsteps, one set moving toward the door. The door opened on its chain. The light behind the woman in the gap was bad, and it took Holt a half-second to read what he was looking at. Then he saw the shape of her face, the way she was holding herself, and he put the picture together. June Cross, dark hair, a cut on her lower lip that was fresh and swelling the skin around it already beginning to color. She was looking at him with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral and not quite getting there. "Ma'am," he said, "your daughter came and found us. She's safe. She's at Harlan's on Route 9. We called 911. Something moved in June's eyes. A flicker that was both relief and terror living in the exact same space, which was what happened when the danger was still in the room behind you. "There's no problem here," she said. The flatness of someone reading from a script they had not written and did not fully believe. "I hear something that says different." Holt kept his voice without pressure. "I'm not asking you to open the door, but I need to know you're okay before we leave." Movement behind her. The door was pushed shut hard from inside, not by June. Then it opened again all the way this time. The chain had been taken off. The man standing behind June was maybe 35, lean in the way of someone who ate badly and stayed angry, wearing a thermal shirt with a tear at the collar. His expression had rehearsed itself into something that was supposed to look reasonable and was wearing the rehearsal badly. "Help you?" His eyes moved from Holt to the bikes at the curb, then to the other three men standing in the driveway. Something shifted behind his expression. A recalculation. "Just checking on the neighbors," Holt said. "Weather being what it is, we're fine. Good to hear." Holt held eye contact. June. She was slightly behind Roy Dent, her eyes on a point near Holt's shoulder. The careful navigation of someone in a room where every body position carries meaning, and she was managing all of it simultaneously. "Della's okay," Holt said. "Just that. Just the fact delivered without anything attached to it." He watched June's eyes close 1 second, no more. The only crack she allowed herself while Roy was still standing in the same room. "You heard the man," Roy said. "We're fine. You can go." "We'll stay until the deputies get here," Holt said, "just to make sure the weather doesn't cause any other trouble tonight." Roy's jaw worked. He looked at Holt, then past him at Briggs, who was standing at the edge of the yard with his arms loose at his sides, taking up space the way only Briggs could, not threatening exactly, just permanent like a wall that had decided to have opinions. The calculation happened visibly in Roy's expression. The measuring of options, the finding of them, limited the decision to leave it for now. "Suit yourself," he said, and stepped back from the door. He didn't pull it shut, just stepped back into the house. June stayed in the doorway for a moment. Her eyes found Holt's face directly for the first time. "She's really okay," her voice barely above a whisper. "She's got a blanket and a handful of sugar packets, and she's waiting for you," Holt said. "That's a tough kid you've got." Something in June's face started to do a complicated thing and stopped itself before it finished. She pressed her lips together. "She is," she said very quietly. Then she stepped back and the door closed and the chain went on again from inside. Holt stood on the porch in the storm. He listened to the house. He felt the weight of what was still inside it, still in the room with her. The sound he'd heard through the door before he knocked, the sound that had stopped when he knocked. He knew what kind of room produced that kind of sound. He'd been in enough of them, not in a diner, not as the man at the table, but in other configurations, other years earlier, parts of a life he'd been moving away from at various speeds for 18 years. He went back down the porch steps. "Deputies are 12 out," Reagan said quietly, his phone already in his hand. "She's alive." He backed off when he saw the bikes. He's still in there. Holt looked at the house. "We wait." He said it with the flatness of a decision that was finished. Briggs and Levi had moved to the flanking positions without being told, one on each side of the driveway approach. They stood there in the storm with the patient stillness of men who have learned waiting from hard teachers. Reagan leaned against his bike and said nothing. Holt stood in the driveway and watched the house and listened to it and thought about an 8-year-old girl who had run a mile and a half through a November storm because her mother had known the right thing to do when the ordinary options ran out. Find someone who already knows how bad things can get. Deputy Ada Marsh came in 11 minutes, her partner Delgado right behind. Headlights cutting through the storm, the cruiser pulling up to the cul-de-sac with the controlled speed of law enforcement, arriving at a situation they've assessed en route. Holt met Ada at the edge of the driveway and gave her the briefing in flat factual sentences. What Della had reported, what he'd observed at the door, the state of June's lip, the man inside who had not introduced himself. Reagan provided the name from the records he'd pulled while they waited. Ada was maybe 30, practical and unsentimental in the way of small-town deputies who had seen enough that the job had stopped holding surprises for them. She looked at Holt's cut, took in the bikes, made her own assessment of what she was looking at, and it was clearly her own, separate from whatever assumptions she might have arrived with. "You can go now," she said. "Appreciate it," Holt said. "I mean it." She held his gaze. "The fewer people on this porch when I go in, the cleaner this gets. For her." She said it without malice, just clarity. He nodded. He looked at the house one more time, at the light in the windows, at the sideways wreath on the door, at the child's bicycle on the porch, and then he pulled his helmet on and got on his bike. The four of them rode back to Route 9. At Harlan's, Della was sitting at the counter with Willa, who had produced actual hot chocolate from somewhere in the back room and was telling her something that had made her laugh. A real laugh, not a performance, not the sound of a child trying to seem all right. A genuine child's laugh, the sound of someone whose body has just decided the immediate danger level has dropped below the threshold that required all available resources. Della looked up when the four bikers came through the door. Her eyes went straight to Holt. He held up one hand, a small gesture, nothing elaborate, just the fact of his return and what it meant. She read it entirely correctly and turned back to her hot chocolate. They waited. Ada called Holt's cell at 40 minutes past. Roy Dent had been removed from the premises and placed in a cruiser pending an emergency protective order. June Cross had been transported to Mercy General, the cut on her lip, 2 bruised ribs, and a bruise on her left forearm that was older than tonight. Della would be brought to the hospital to be reunited with her mother once June was settled. "She going to be okay," Holt said. "She'll be fine," Ada said. "Stable, being treated, family services already notified. Standard protocol from here." A pause. "You the one the daughter came to?" "She came to us," Holt said. A beat that had something in it. "I'll need contact information. Statements probably tomorrow." He gave her his number. She hung up. He put his phone in his jacket and sat back down in the booth. Willa brought him coffee without being asked. Hot this time. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked into it for a long moment. Levi sat across from him. "She okay?" "She'll be fine," Holt said. He heard it in his own voice, the flatness of a man saying what was true and knowing it wasn't complete. Levi looked at him for a moment with the patience of 29 years that had held more than they should have. "You all right?" "I'm always all right," Holt said. Levi didn't press it. He knew better. They all did. Della sat at the counter and finished her hot chocolate and held her rabbit in both arms. When the deputy came to take her to the hospital, she climbed off the stool and turned and looked at Holt across the diner. He gave her a nod. She gave him one back, a small, serious, complete nod. And then she went with the deputy, and the diner door swung shut behind her, and the storm kept coming. The four of them sat for another hour. Nobody suggested leaving. Nobody talked directly about what had happened, but the shape of it was in the room with them, the shape of something that had walked through the door at 7:42 and changed the weight of the air. Holt thought about June's eyes closing for that 1 second when he told her Della was safe. 1 second and then back to neutral, because neutral was what was required while Roy Dent was still standing in the room behind her. He thought about the bicycle on the porch, the flower boxes, the sideways wreath, the effort that a life like that required, the constant management of danger wearing the clothes of ordinary domestic life, the exhausting daily negotiation of it. How much of a person's energy that consumed day after day and what was left over for everything else. He picked up his phone, set it back down. Just after midnight, a text came through from a number he didn't recognize. Not the number he'd given Ada, and not a number in his contacts. A moment later, he understood it was Della's phone, and June had gotten to it somehow at the hospital because the message read, "This is June. Della made me text. She said thank you." "I say thank you. I don't know what else to say. I've been in this alone for a long time." He read it twice, then he typed back, "You're not now." He looked at what he'd written. He sent it. He put the phone face down on the table. Reagan, who had watched him look at the phone without comment, said nothing. Briggs had gone to pay Willa, pressing considerably more money across the counter than the bill required, in the deliberate way Briggs had of communicating things he didn't put into words. Levi had his arms folded and his chin back down, the unconsciousness of someone who had learned to sleep wherever sleep offered itself, regardless of what the situation around him had just been. It was a good night. Della was safe. June was at Mercy General with ribs that would heal. Roy Dent was in the back of Ada's cruiser. The system was doing what the system did. It was a good night. Holt stared at the tabletop and tried to locate the good of it, and what he found instead was the cold, specific knowledge that men like Roy Dent came back, that protective orders were paper, that the distance between what the law could do and what the law could prevent was a gap that men like Roy understood in their bones and knew how to live inside of. He knew this because he'd been in enough of these situations, not in a diner, not as the man at the table in other configurations, other circumstances, earlier parts of a life he'd been moving away from at various speeds for 18 years. He knew how the arithmetic of it worked. He knew what the morning looked like after a night like this one. He was right about the morning. At 9:47, Ada called and delivered the information in the careful clipped voice of someone saying a professional thing about something they personally found enraging. Roy Dent had made bail. His brother Trent had posted $5,000. The arraignment had taken 22 minutes. Conditions of release: no contact with the victim, standard, restricted zones. He'd been advised to vacate Black Hollow. "He'll go," Holt said. "Probably not," Ada said. She delivered it like a weather forecast she already knew was wrong. He sat with that. By 11 o'clock, he'd gotten coffee from the motel vending machine and was sitting in the parking lot watching the sky, which was clear after the storm, the specific washed-out blue of November mornings that looked like clarity and felt like cold. He was doing the math that you do when you've been in the business of other people's emergencies long enough to know how the arithmetic works. Bond posted at 10:15, no contact order. A man with a brother who posts $5,000 inside 2 hours is a man with resources and history in this town. A man who comes back inside 2 hours of making bond, who comes back to a house he's been legally ordered away from, comes back with a specific destination in mind rather than just a feeling. That distinction mattered. The distinction between a man who loses control and a man who moves deliberately inside the appearance of losing control. That gap was where the worst of it lived. His phone buzzed at 11:43, not from June's number, not from any number he recognized, from Della's phone. A text Della had sent herself from the hospital because she was 8 years old and had read the situation and decided something needed to happen. 3 words. "He's here. Please help." Holt was on his bike before the screen went dark. The thing about a man who has spent 18 years running from the weight of his own history was that he knew exactly what it felt like when the running stopped. Not a choice exactly. More like physics. More like the moment when the distance finally ran out and you were left with nothing between you and the thing you'd been moving away from. The fact of yourself. The fact of what you were capable of and what you weren't. The fact of a fire you'd gone into and the weight of what you'd carried out of it and what you hadn't. He called Reagan. He called Briggs. Called Levi. He rode. The ghosts he'd been out running for 18 years didn't need motorcycles. They were already there ahead of him, waiting at 14 Cedar Lane under a blue November sky. And for the first time since he was 23 years old and standing in front of a building that was burning, Holt Kane rode toward them instead of away. What he found when he turned onto Cedar Lane, what he saw when he pulled up to the small house at the end of the cul-de-sac with its sideways wreath and its dead flower boxes and its child's bicycle leaned against the porch siding, stopped every thought in his head and replaced it with a single cold, very clear certainty. The front door was standing open. June's car was gone. And hanging from the porch railing, suspended by one ear left there like a message addressed to whoever came looking, was Della's stuffed rabbit. The stuffed rabbit hung from the porch railing by one ear. Holt stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked at it, long enough to register it, long enough for the quality of what it meant to settle into his chest, the way cold water finds its level, not fast, not dramatic, just inevitable and complete. Then he was moving up the steps through the open door into the house. The living room had been a fight, not the dramatic kind, not overturned furniture and shattered glass, the kind that exists in movies and looks like chaos. This was the other kind, the domestic kind, the kind that left specific evidence of specific moments and was worse for its specificity. A mug on its side on the coffee table, contents soaked into the carpet in a dark stain that was still wet at the edges. A chair pulled 2 feet from where it had lived, the legs leaving drag marks in the carpet that showed exactly how far and in what direction. A throw pillow on the floor near the hallway. June's cell phone face down near the baseboard, screen spiderweb from one corner to the other. The damage that happens when a phone hits a floor after being knocked from a hand rather than dropped. Holt picked it up. Locked. He set it on the coffee table. He moved through the house, fast and methodical. Room to room, bathroom, kitchen. Della's bedroom. The bedroom of an 8-year-old who liked horses. There was a poster above her bed taped with the kind of care that said, "This matters, edges, straight corners, pressed flat." 3 library books on the nightstand. A pair of sneakers on the floor that were not the ones she'd been wearing last night. The window was open. The screen had been pushed out from inside. You could tell from the direction the frame had bent, the way the corners had given, the way you leave a room when the front door isn't an option. He went back to the porch. Reagan was pulling up to the cul-de-sac. Then Briggs, then Levi. The 3 bikes filling the space behind his engines dying one by one into the November quiet. "She's gone," Holt said. "Both of them. June's car is gone." Reagan got off his bike and came up the walk. He looked at the rabbit. He looked at Holt. He didn't say anything yet. "Forced bedroom window from inside," Holt said. Della went out the window. He looked at the open front door. June went out the front with him. Car is gone. Her phone is on the floor in there, cracked. "He took her," Levi said from the walk. "He took June," Holt said. Della ran first. He looked at the rabbit hanging from the railing by one ear. "She left this." A beat of silence. "That's not something a scared kid does," Reagan said quietly. "No," Holt said. "It's not. A child who runs from danger in a panic doesn't stop. A child running on pure adrenaline and fear doesn't pause at the porch railing to leave anything behind. A child who leaves her most important object hanging deliberately from a railing is leaving it on purpose for someone specific, because she has thought about what comes next, even while the immediate thing was still happening around her. She knew he would come. She left him something to find, something that said she had been here, something that said follow." Holt took the rabbit off the railing. He held it for a moment, the small damp weight of it, the matted fabric, the one eye that was slightly loose from years of use. Then he put it in the inside pocket of his cut against his chest and turned to the group. "Briggs, get Walsh on the phone." He meant Ada Marsh. They'd been calling her by her last name since last night, the natural shorthand. "Tell her June's car is gone and Roy Dent violated the no-contact order and we need the plate run and put out." "On it," Briggs said. "Reagan, Roy's brother, Trent Dent. Name, address, anything you can pull. He posted bail, he's connected to Roy, and he's connected to this town." Reagan already had his phone out. "Levi, talk to anyone on the street who might have seen the car leave. What time, what direction, how many people in it?" Levi nodded once and moved. Holt stood on the porch and pulled out his own phone and called June's number. It rang from the coffee table inside the house, muffled the specific ring of a phone in exactly these circumstances. He hung up. He looked at the street. He thought about the math. The math he'd been doing since 9:47 this morning, since Ada had called and told him Roy Dent was out on $5,000 and had been advised to leave town. A man who comes back 2 hours after making bond, who violates a no-contact order the same morning it's issued, who comes back not in anger or not only in anger, but with a destination and a plan. That distinction kept returning to him. The difference between a man who loses control and a man who moves deliberately inside the appearance of losing control. He'd been thinking about it since the parking lot this morning. He was thinking about it now with the open door behind him and the drag marks in the carpet and June's cracked phone on the coffee table. Ada picked up on the second ring. Holt told her. There was a silence on her end that had a quality to it, not surprise, more like a woman receiving information she had already been bracing for and was now processing with the controlled efficiency of someone managing too many variables. "When," she said, "sometime in the last 2 hours. Her phone is here, car is gone." He looked at Reagan, who was scrolling. Reagan held up the phone so Holt could read the plate. Holt relayed it. "Putting it out now," Ada said. He heard her already moving, the ambient sound of her environment changing. "Dent made bond at 10:15. I've had 2 other calls this morning and I'm down to me and Delgado until 2. A pause that was doing specific work. "I need you to tell me everything stayed outside that house." "I found an empty house," Holt said. "Keep it that way, Holt." The first time she'd used his name. He registered it. "I mean it. You find something, you call me first, before anything else. Copy, he said and hung up. Levi came back around from the side of the house, hands in his jacket pockets, moving with the economy of a man who has learned to carry information without letting it show on his face until he's ready to deliver it. Woman 3 houses down walks her dog early. She was out at 11:35, maybe 11:40. Saw a blue car leave Cedar Lane. Man driving, woman in the passenger seat. He paused. She thought the woman was sleeping. The word sleeping settled into the group with the full weight of what it meant and didn't mean. Della, Holt said. Didn't see a child, just the two in front. Holt processed that. Della had gone out the bedroom window before June went out the front door, which meant Della was on foot somewhere, which meant Della had gotten out, which meant there was an 8-year-old girl somewhere in Black Hollow on a cold November morning, on foot without her phone, with no one knowing where she was. She'd left the rabbit. The rabbit was her comfort object, the thing she always took, the thing she'd carried through a 1.5 miles of storm last night because it was what she always took. And she had made a deliberate choice to leave it behind, which meant she had chosen communication over comfort, which meant she was thinking clearly even in the middle of running, which meant she had left it because she knew what leaving it would communicate and to whom. She's moving, Holt said. She's not lost. She's running somewhere specific. Back to us, Reagan said. He said it simply without drama. She found us last night. She knows where we are. She knows the diner. He looked at Holt steadily. She left that. A nod toward Holt's chest, toward the pocket where the rabbit was. Because she knew you'd come here first, and she knew you'd understand it. She's not lost. She's running to Harlan's. Levi was already moving toward his bike. I'll take Route 9 south, Levi said, if she's cutting toward the highway. Creek Trail, Holt said, looking at Briggs. She came through the woods last night. She knows it. If she's moving fast and trying to stay off the road, that's her route. Briggs was already on his bike. I'm riding to Harlan's, Reagan said. If she gets there before any of us, Willa needs to know to hold her and not let her leave. Holt was on his bike. He looked down the street toward Millhaven Road, which was east of here, which was where the pull in his chest had been pointing since Reagan said the name Trent Dent. I'm going to look at a road. Reagan looked at him, held it. Walsh said, I'm going to look at a road. Holt said again. That's all. Reagan held his gaze for a moment longer. There was something in his expression, not doubt exactly, more like the weariness of a man who has watched someone make a certain kind of decision before and knows what the road downstream of it looks like. He held it, and then he nodded once, and he rode. Millhaven Road ran east from the edge of Black Hollow through a stretch of land that had been agricultural once. The bones of it were still there in the grid of old fence lines, in the occasional weathered outbuilding sitting in fields that had gone back to grass and scrub. The road itself was maintained enough to be passable and neglected enough to make clear that no one with any official interest came this way with any regularity. The kind of road that existed in its own quiet removal from the rest of things. Holt rode it slowly, not toward any property, just the road itself, the first mile of it, reading the physical facts of the place, the way he'd learned to read physical facts in environments where reading them correctly was the difference between finding someone and not finding them. The land here didn't feel like nothing. That was the thing he registered first and couldn't fully account for, and took seriously because he'd learned to take that kind of registration seriously. The fence lines along the road's north side looked neglected at a glance. Old wood posts weathered gray, leaning at various angles. But the wire strung between them was new. He could tell from the absence of oxidation at the attachment points, from the way the wire caught the flat November light differently than old wire did. Someone had restrung this fence recently and had used the old post to make it look like nothing had changed. An outbuilding a 1/4 mile off the road had new metal roofing on an otherwise deteriorating structure. The contrast visible even at distance, the bright corrugated silver sitting wrong on the weathered wood walls beneath it. And in the dirt shoulder of the road, tire tracks. Multiple sets from multiple vehicles. Recent, the edges still sharp, not yet softened by wind or moisture. More than one vehicle, more than one recent visit, coming and going, in patterns that didn't suggest any legitimate agricultural use of the land. Holt stopped at the half-mile mark and sat on the bike and looked at all of it. A man who'd come back within 2 hours of making bond with a specific destination in mind. New wire on old fence lines, a missing woman in a blue car, an outbuilding with a new roof. He took out his phone. He looked at Ada's number. He thought about what he could tell her that constituted evidence and what constituted a man reading fence lines on a county road and feeling something wrong in the quality of the air. He called anyway. Voicemail. He left a message, the road, the fence lines, the tire tracks, the outbuilding. He kept his voice level and factual. He hung up. His phone rang 2 minutes later. Not Ada. Reagan. She's here, Reagan said. At Harlan's. She walked in 2 minutes ago. She's okay. Holt let out a breath that he hadn't fully known he was holding. How is she? Cold, scared underneath, but holding the surface of it. A pause, Reagan's voice doing the thing it did when he was keeping it very controlled. She says her mom didn't fight him, Holt. She says June went with him. She heard her mom say, "Don't hurt her," and then she heard the front door, and that was when she went out the window. Holt sat with that on the shoulder of Millhaven Road. She says her mom did it on purpose, Reagan said. Went with him to give her time to get out. He rode back to Harlan's. Della was in the back booth, the same booth as last night, the one that faced the door, wearing the same clothes still damp in places from last night's storm. She had a mug of hot chocolate in both hands, and she was watching the door with the focused, unblinking attention of someone managing fear through vigilance, through the act of keeping her eyes on the thing that might bring more of it. When Holt came through the door, something in her posture changed. Not dramatic, just a small, specific settling. The release of a thing that had been held in suspension. He sat down across from her. He reached into the inside pocket of his cut and set the rabbit on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't pick it up immediately, just looked at it. Something moved through her face that she didn't try to control or cover. You left it there for me to find, he said. So you'd know I got out, she said. So you'd know she didn't. He looked at her. 8 years old, running this level of problem solving in the middle of a situation that would have paralyzed most adults. Choosing communication over comfort. Choosing the signal over the thing the signal cost her to leave behind. Your mom went with him on purpose, he said, not a question. She pushed me toward my window before he got inside. Della said it with the terrible casualness of a child describing something that should never have had to become ordinary. We have a thing we practiced. Holt was very still. She always said if he came back and it was bad, I go out the window. I go south on the creek trail. I get to Route 9. I find an adult who looks like they've seen trouble. She looked at the rabbit. We practiced the window 3 times in October. The booth was quiet. 3 times in October. June Cross had known. She had known this was coming, not that night specifically maybe, but the shape of it. The eventual return of it. And she had spent October teaching her 8-year-old daughter how to go out a window and where to run and what kind of person to run toward. She knew he was going to come back, Holt said. She always knew, Della said. The flatness of a child reporting a fact that has simply always been true. Reagan was behind him somewhere. Holt was aware of him at the counter, not pretending to be elsewhere. Willa had moved to the far end and was doing something that required all of her attention. Della, Holt said carefully, did your mom ever say anything about where Roy would take her if this happened? A small hesitation, the first one he'd seen from her. She mentioned a place once, she said slowly. The concentrated frown of a child pulling something up from memory with the seriousness of an adult. She said there was a property, something about his brother. She looked up at him. She said if I ever disappear, that's where I am. And that means it's already too late. The words landed in the booth like stones dropped into still water. Did she say the name of the road? Holt asked. His voice was steady. Della shook her head. Just that it was east and that it wasn't really his brother's. She frowned again harder. She said it like she knew something about it that she didn't want to know. Holt looked at Reagan over Della's head. Reagan met his eyes. His face said he'd heard all of it. Briggs came through the diner door at that moment, cold air following him in, and looked at the booth and then at Reagan, and his eyebrows went up in the shorthand of 6 years of shared road. "Found something," Briggs said. Holt got up from the booth. He looked at Della. "Stay here. Don't move from this spot. Will is here. Reagan's here." He looked at Reagan. "Don't leave her." Reagan pulled out the bench across from Della and sat down. He looked at her with the careful patience of a man who has learned how to be still in rooms that require it. "You play cards," Reagan said. "A beat." "Go fish," Della said. "I can work with that." He already had a deck coming out of his jacket pocket, not produced dramatically, just there. The way useful things were always just there with Reagan. Holt went to the door with Briggs. Outside, the cold had teeth. They stood in the diner's small vestibule door closed behind them, and through the window, Holt could see Reagan dealing two hands with the deliberate, unhurried calm of a man trying to be the least alarming thing in a room. "I found June's car," Briggs said. Holt's eyes came to him. Cedar Creek Bridge, half-mile down from the house, pulled off in the brush on the east bank, partially hidden. Briggs's voice was flat and precise. "Engine was still warm when I found it." Holt worked through that. "He drove her out in her own car and then switched vehicles. Or someone else did, because there's something else." Briggs held up his phone. A photographed dark-colored vehicle parked on the road near the bridge. Partial plate visible. "I didn't see the driver, but that's not a local plate. County prefix I don't recognize from anywhere near here." Holt looked at the photograph for a long moment. "Briggs," he said, "that company Reagan found. Millhaven Land Holdings. When was it incorporated?" Briggs was already on his phone. "4 years ago, registered agent in Carthage." He stopped, read something, read it again. "Holt, the registered agent for Millhaven Land Holdings, is the same agent as 4 other LLCs in a 3-county area." He turned the phone so Holt could see the results. All property holding companies, all registered in the last 5 years, all with no public-facing business. 5 companies, 3 counties, no public business. The same registered agent threading through all of them like a wire running behind a wall. "Reagan needs to see this," Holt said. They went back inside. Holt took the phone to the counter and waited for Reagan to look up from the card game. Della had apparently dealt them both a hand and was watching Reagan's face with the focused, competitive attention of a child who takes Go Fish seriously. When Reagan came to the counter and looked at the phone, he was quiet for a long moment. "I've seen this pattern before," he said, low enough that the booth couldn't hear it. Holt looked at him. "Where?" Not a question. He knew from Reagan's voice that it wasn't a question. Reagan set the phone on the counter. He looked at it. He looked at Holt, and his face did the thing it only did when he was pulling something up from a place he kept very carefully covered. Not blank, not cold, but composed in the way of a man who has learned that keeping certain things contained is a discipline, not a repression. "Before the club," Reagan said, "when I was doing work I don't talk about." He said it without elaboration, without invitation for follow-up. There were networks running women through property holdings in rural counties. Shell companies rotating vehicles, properties that looked abandoned or agricultural but weren't. The women came in through domestic situations, men who had existing relationships with them, men who could move them without raising flags because on paper it just looked like a man and his girlfriend having a bad time. He said it flatly, the way you say a thing you have had to learn to hold without it destroying you from the inside. A way of acquiring people without it looking like acquiring. The diner was very quiet. "Trafficking," Holt said. The word landed the way those words land, with weight and with the irreversibility of a thing that cannot be unsaid once it's been named. "I don't know for certain," Reagan said, "but the pattern—" "Ada needs to know this now," Holt said. He had his phone out. "Ada is one deputy and a partner covering a county on a day when she's already down resources," Reagan said. He wasn't arguing. He was reciting facts. "The kind of call that turns a pattern like this into a task force takes time. State resources, the right contacts, hours minimum, possibly a day." Holt looked at him. June Cross doesn't have a day. I know. She might not have hours. I know, Holt. Then tell me what we're deciding here. Reagan held his gaze. The scar from below his ear to his collar was very visible in the flat diner light, and his eyes had the quality they got when he was holding something specific inside a very controlled container, not cold, more like something that had been given a shape and was committed to keeping it. I'm not telling you what to decide, Reagan said. I'm telling you what the situation is. I know what the situation is. Then you know what you're thinking about doing isn't reconnaissance. And I need to know if that's what we're actually talking about before I'm any part of it. From the booth behind them, Della's voice asking for 2 cards. The sound of a card deck being shuffled. The mundane, terrible normalcy of a child playing Go Fish, while her mother was somewhere east of town in a vehicle that had already changed hands once. Holt put his phone on the counter. He looked at it. He thought about Ada's voicemail, the message he'd left about the fence lines. He thought about the time it would take to move a response through the right channels, the legitimate channels, the system that existed specifically to handle this kind of thing. He thought about every hour inside that system and what those hours looked like from the inside of a property on Millhaven Road. He thought about 18 years of motion, the arithmetic of it, how much distance you needed before you stopped being able to feel what you were putting distance between yourself and whether the answer was more distance or something else entirely. He thought about a burning building, a face in a window, the absolute knowledge of being one wrong decision away from the kind of thing you carry for the rest of your life. He picked up his phone. He called Ada. She picked up, this time road noise moving. I left you a message, he said. I got it. Millhaven Road. I'm running the company names. What else? He told her. The registration pattern, the 5 LLCs, the 3 counties. The vehicle at Cedar Creek Bridge, the partial plate. And then the framework of what Reagan had described, not verbatim, just the shape of it, the structure, the acquisition method, what it was designed to look like from the outside, why it had been working. When he was done, Ada was silent for a moment that had a specific quality to it. I'm calling the state, she said. I'm calling county. If this is what you're saying it is, this is bigger than anything this jurisdiction has seen in 20 years. A pause. And I need people I can actually trust to hold a chain of evidence. How long, Holt said. Realistically, she breathed. State contact on a call in an hour. Actual boots on that property with a valid warrant 3 hours. If everything moves perfectly, maybe 4. And if it doesn't move perfectly, she didn't answer that. Walsh, he said. I mean it, she said. Her voice had the sharp edge of someone asking directly. If you go near that property and something goes wrong, if you do anything that lets a lawyer stand up in front of a jury and point at you, these people walk. Every woman on that property testifies in a case that falls apart. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Holt stood very still. 3 hours, he said. Maybe 4. If everything... He hung up. He stood at the counter for a moment. He looked at the window at the pale November sky going thin and gray at the edges with the afternoon coming on. 3 hours. 4 hours. The day shortening. The light going. He turned around. Reagan was watching him. Briggs was watching him. Levi had come in while he was on the phone and was standing by the door, arms folded, watching him. 3 men who had followed him here because that was what they did, who had never asked him to account for what drove him, who had given him every mile and every cold morning and every decision that lived at the edge of the law and every silence that asked nothing of him except that he keep showing up. He looked at all 3 of them. Walsh is making calls, he said. State, county. She needs 3 to 4 hours to get the right people with the right warrants. Nobody said anything. June Cross might not have 3 to 4 hours. Reagan said, Holt, I know what I'm asking. I don't think you do. Reagan stepped closer. Not aggressive, Reagan was never aggressive, even in the moments when he was the most dangerous thing in a room, which was often. What you're asking is for us to go into a property that is very possibly part of a trafficking operation with no warrant and no backup, and do something we have no legal framework for, and come out with a woman alive and have all of it mean something legally and not get any of us killed in the process. He said it quietly. I've done that before. I know what it costs. Then you know what not doing it costs, Holt said. Reagan held his gaze for a long moment. The scar on his face was doing nothing. His face was doing nothing. He was very still in the way of someone who has learned that stillness is a choice and is choosing it deliberately. Yeah, Reagan said. I know what that costs too. Levi said from the door, I'm in. Briggs said nothing. He set his helmet on the counter with the quiet finality of a man who had already made his decision some time ago and was only now making it visible. Holt looked at Reagan. Reagan looked back at him with those careful, settled eyes, and something in them that was tired and certain and completely unsurprised. You knew I'd say yes, Reagan said. I hoped, Holt said. Something moved under Reagan's expression. Brief, not nothing. Holt turned to the booth. Della was watching them over the back of the seat, her card hand held against her chest, watching with those eyes that had been reading rooms for as long as she'd needed to. She had been watching them the whole time, had read the room the same way she read every room. He walked to the booth. He crouched down so he was at her eye level, which put significant strain on his knees against the linoleum floor of Harlan's diner, and he did not care about that at all. I'm going to get your mom, he said. Not we think we might not, we're going to try. Just the fact of it delivered the way you deliver facts to someone who has stopped believing in anything less than the direct statement. Della looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. The same way she'd said, I know last night at the door, like she'd been waiting for him to say it out loud. Willa's going to stay with you. You don't leave this building. You don't open that door for anyone you don't know. If you hear anything that sounds wrong, you call 911 and you stay on the line. He held her gaze. Understood. Understood, she said. He started to stand. Her hand came out and caught his wrist. Small fingers on the burn scar on the pale gathered skin of 18 years, and she held it with the surprising grip of a child who has learned that grip is how you keep things from leaving before you finish with them. Holt, she said. First time she'd used his name. He looked at her. She went with him so I could get out, Della said. She always does the thing that keeps me safe. A pause brief and complete. Don't let it not have been worth it. He held her gaze for a moment. He put his other hand over hers, just the weight of it briefly, the gravity of one person acknowledging another fully. I won't, he said. He stood up. He pulled his helmet off the counter. He looked at Willa, who was already reaching under the counter for her own phone, already unlocked, already in hand, who met his eyes with the clear expression of a woman who had been in Black Hollow long enough to know exactly what was happening and had already made her own decision about it. He went to the door. Outside, the sky had gone the gray of old iron. The temperature had dropped 2 more degrees while they were inside. The 4 bikes sat in the parking lot in the formation they always held, not a line, not a row, but the natural clustering of 4 machines whose riders had spent 6 years sharing road. The grammar of belonging. Holt pulled on his gloves. The leather was stiff in the cold. He thought about Millhaven Road. He thought about the fence lines and the new wire and the tire tracks and the dirt shoulder and what they added up to. He thought about Ada's voice on the phone, these people walk, and about the weight of what that meant and what the alternative meant and which weight he could live with. He thought about a building on fire. He thought about a window. He put his helmet on. He started his bike. The other 3 started theirs, a staggered sequence one after another, the percussion of 4 engines waking up in cold air. The sound of it filled the parking lot and rolled out into the November gray. It was not a quiet sound. It was declarative in the way certain sounds are declarative, addressed to no one specific, requiring no response, simply a statement of intent sent out into a world that was going to hear it regardless. He pulled out of the lot under Route 9 East. They hadn't gone a mile when his phone buzzed against his chest through the leather, through the cut, through the rabbit still in his inside pocket. He felt it, and he registered it, and he kept riding because he was in motion now, and motion was the thing, and looking at a phone on Route 9 in November wasn't the thing. It buzzed a second time, A third. At the turnoff from Millhaven Road, he finally pulled to the shoulder and looked. 3 texts. From a number he didn't recognize, not Ada, not anyone in his contacts. 3 messages in rapid sequence, 2 minutes apart. The first, Holt Kane stop. The second, you don't know what you're riding into. This is bigger than Roy Dent. These are people with reach you haven't measured. The third June cross isn't the first. She won't be the last if you go in loud. Stand down and let the people who know this network handle it, or you'll burn the whole operation and they'll just rebuild it somewhere else. He read them 3 times. He looked up at the road ahead, Millhaven Road stretching east into the gray afternoon, the fence lines on both sides, the flat agricultural land gone quiet with November. He looked at the texts again. The people who know this network. He turned on the bike and held up a fist. The stop signal. The other 3 pulled up alongside him. He passed Reagan his phone without a word. Reagan read the messages. His face didn't move. He passed the phone to Briggs, who passed it to Levi. Levi looked up. Who is this? I don't know, Holt said. Could be Walsh, Briggs said. Could be someone on her team. Not her number, not her syntax, Reagan said. He looked at the phone, then at the road. Somebody else has eyes on this. Or it's a threat dressed like a warning, Holt said. Or it's a warning dressed like a threat, Levi said. The 4 of them sat on the shoulder of Millhaven Road with their engines idling, in the cold working through every seam, in the gray sky pressing down, and the road ahead going where it went. If someone else knows about this network, Holt said slowly, then either they're part of it and this is them trying to hold us off while they clear the property. He paused. Or they're not part of it and they've been working it longer than us, and going in loud right now actually does burn something they've spent real time building. We can't know which, Briggs said. No, Holt said. We can't. The engines idled. The wind moved through the dry grass on both sides of the road. Somewhere east of here, on a property with new wire on old fence lines and tire tracks from vehicles that didn't belong to this county, there was a woman who had walked out her own front door with a violent man so that her daughter could climb out a window. Holt's phone buzzed one more time. Same number. She's still alive. But you have maybe 2 hours before that changes. If you go in alone and loud, you'll save 1 woman and lose the rest. Your call. He read it. He put the phone back in his jacket. He looked down Millhaven Road. He looked at 3 men on motorcycles who had followed him here, because that was what they did without accounting, without conditions, without asking him to justify the thing that drove him. He thought about, you'll save 1 woman and lose the rest. He thought about June walking out her own front door deliberately and what that had cost her and what it had been meant to buy. He thought about Ada's voice these people walk and about a burning building and a face in a window and the absolute knowledge of being 1 wrong decision away from the kind of mistake that lives in you for 18 years. And then he made a decision that was not the same as the decision he'd been making for 18 years, which had always been the decision to keep moving to stay ahead of the weight of it, to let distance be the answer to everything. The distance kept failing to answer. He looked at Reagan. We don't go in loud, he said. Reagan went very still. We go in quiet, Holt said. 2 of us on foot from the north through the tree line. We find out what's there. We don't touch anything we don't have to touch. We don't move anything we don't have to move. We don't engage unless there is no other option. He looked at Briggs, then Levi. You 2 hold the road. Anything comes out of that property in a vehicle, you get the plate and you call Ada. You don't stop it. You don't follow it. You get the plate and you call. He looked at Reagan. You and me on foot, Reagan said. On foot. A beat. Reagan looked down the road. He looked at Holt's jacket at the pocket where the rabbit was. The person who sent those texts, whoever they are, we're betting they're the second option. We're betting on it, Holt said. There's a difference between betting and knowing, but it's the bet I'm making. Reagan looked at him for a long moment with those careful, settled eyes. Then he nodded once small complete, a gesture that meant everything it needed to mean and nothing beyond it. They left the bikes with Briggs and Levi on the shoulder 100 yards back from the Millhaven Road turnoff, out of sight behind a stand of scrub pine that had grown up along the fence line. Holt and Reagan went over the fence and into the field, moving north and parallel to the road, the dead grass stiff and crackling under their boots, the cold working against every exposed surface. Neither of them spoke. They moved in the practiced silence of men who had learned in different rooms in different years that silence was a tool with as many uses as anything else you carried. You used it to listen, to conceal, to give a situation the space it needed to tell you what it was before you told it what you were. The property emerged from the flatland at 3/4 of a mile, a cluster of structures behind the fence line, with the new wire exactly where Holt had read it from the road that morning. A main building that had once been a farmhouse, ground floor windows boarded. A metal roll-up door installed on what had been a side entrance. Two outbuildings, one with the new corrugated roof catching what was left of the afternoon light. A gravel yard between the structures. Two vehicles. A dark truck, the partial plate from Briggs's photograph, rest of it visible now. Holt fixed it in his memory. And a white panel van backed up tight against the side entrance windows, blacked from inside. Holt and Reagan stopped at the tree line and crouched and looked. No visible personnel in the yard. One light burning in the main building through a gap in the boarding on the second floor. The roll-up door down. The van's engine cold, it had been there a while. Reagan leaned close, barely above breath. Two vehicles, 2 to 4 people minimum. We don't know the interior layout. Holt looked at the van, backed up to the entrance. Engine cold. Sitting there like something waiting to be loaded. That was a loading position. He looked at Reagan. They went over the fence. Moving across the gravel yard was the part that required the specific, absolute focus that Holt had found years ago in burning buildings, the state of being entirely in the present moment. Not because it was peaceful, but because the alternative was dying. And dying was something he'd been postponing with increasing stubbornness for 18 years. Each step on the gravel placed with care. Weight transferred slowly, heel to toe, the crunch of it minimized by the wind coming across the flat land, by the particular luck of a November afternoon that had enough ambient sound to cover the careful movement of two large men across an open space. They reached the van. Holt put his hand on the rear door handle, looked at Reagan. Reagan positioned himself to the right, back to the van, watching the main building in the yard. Holt opened the van. The smell hit him first. Not blood. Something more institutional than that cleaning product applied over something older and more permanent. The kind of smell that gets into materials and stays regardless of what you put on top of it. The kind of smell that exists in facilities that process people as objects and have learned to maintain a surface appearance of neutrality. The cargo area held 4 benches bolted to the walls. Along the sides of each bench at regular intervals were attachment points, metal loops set into the frame, the kind of attachment points that had one specific purpose and no other. Holt closed the van door. He stood for a moment with his hand still on the handle. He did the internal work of filing what he had just seen into the part of his mind that could hold it without it reaching his face or his hands or the quality of his breath. He'd learned that work in burning buildings too, the discipline of feeling the full weight of something and not letting the weight change what your body needed to do in the next 60 seconds. He looked at Reagan. Reagan had been watching his face and had read it entirely. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't already said by the fact of what Holt had seen and the fact that Reagan could read it in him. They moved to the main building side entrance, staying below the window line, backs to the wall. A regular steel frame door to the left of the roll-up solid retrofitted into the original structure. The kind of installation that said security rather than convenience. Holt put his ear to it. Voices inside. 2 distinct male voices. The words not fully audible through the steel, but the register clear of flat logistical conversation. The tone of people discussing the movement of objects rather than the fate of people. The sound of administrative detachment applied to human lives. And underneath the voices, a third sound. A female voice, not words, just sound. The sound of someone maintaining themselves by producing sound, by refusing to be silent, by existing loudly enough that the room could not forget she was a person in it. Holt recognized it from rooms he had entered, in rooms he had been too late to enter, and it took him exactly 3 seconds to identify it because for those 3 seconds, he kept refusing the identification. He straightened up. Reagan was beside him, had heard it too, and his face had gone to the stillness of someone being asked something old of them. Not blank, not cold, but composed with the discipline of a man who has learned that falling apart is a luxury that could only be afforded after. Holt tried the door. Locked. Steel frame recent installation. He assessed the hinge. The barrel was exterior mount old model, the kind that came with retrofitted installations, where the contractor had used existing hardware. He looked at Reagan. Reagan looked at the hinge for 3 seconds. Then he reached into his boot and produced a flat, narrow tool, a hinge pin puller. The kind of thing that should not have been in Reagan Falk's boot on a routine morning in Black Hollow, and absolutely was. Holt looked at the second-floor window, the one with the light behind it, the boarding installed from the outside, accessible from below. He looked at the rusted fuel tank on a platform bolted to the building's south wall, agricultural infrastructure from the original farm left in place because dismantling it cost effort nobody had bothered to spend. 6 feet up. From the top of the platform, the boarded window was reachable. He looked at Reagan. Reagan looked at the door hinge, then at Holt, the shorthand of 6 years without words. Window, barely a breath. I'm going in the window, same register. 30 seconds from when you go through, I'll have the door. 30 seconds. Holt moved to the platform. He was aware climbing of the negotiation between what he needed his body to do and what his body's accumulated history had to say about it. The burn scar on his left forearm pulled when he gripped the platform edge. It always pulled in cold weather. The skin there tighter than it should be. The permanent physical record of one night 18 years ago, written into the tissue of him in a language that had no translation except this. He climbed anyway. He reached the platform. He stood. The boarding on the window was 4 screws into weathered wood, the screws loose in the frame from years of temperature change and moisture. He worked the corner of one board with his fingers found. Gibb worked it further. The wood came away from the frame with a sound he controlled as much as he could, which was not perfectly, but was enough. He looked through the window. The second floor of the main building had been partially cleared, debris pushed to the walls, a work light on a stand providing the only illumination. 2 men he didn't recognize, both in their 30s, dressed in the generic utility of people who needed to be unremarkable in any environment. One on a phone, his back to the window. The other closer, facing a corner Holt couldn't see from this angle. He shifted on the platform, shifted again, found the angle. June Cross was in the far corner, seated on the floor with her back to the wall, wrists zip-tied in front of her. A gag that she had worked partially down off her mouth because the female voice he'd heard from below, the sound of someone refusing silence, that had been her. Talking or trying to talk. Producing sound with whatever she had available, because sound was the thing that said she was still there, still present, still a person and not an object in a loading position. She was conscious. She was upright. The bruised ribs from this morning showed in the way she was holding herself, a protective angle of the torso that the body adopts automatically when breathing is painful. The spine curved slightly forward and to the right. Her lip was worse than this morning, the cut darkened toward purple dried blood on her chin. But she was upright and she was conscious and she was producing sound. The man facing her corner said something. Holt couldn't hear the words, but he heard the tone. Not hostile. Administrative. The tone of someone explaining a process they had explained many times before to many people seated in the same position and had stopped requiring hostility to deliver because the situation itself was the hostility and everyone in the room knew it. Holt looked at the room. One door, a stairwell visible at the far wall. No other exits on this floor. 2 men, 1 woman. He ran the geometry of it the way he'd learned to run the geometry of structures that were on fire entry points. Egress options, the architecture of a space, and how it shaped what was possible inside it. He looked at the window frame. The opening was large enough. He went back down to Reagan. She's up there, 2nd floor. Tied 2 men, no visible weapons from outside. He said it in the space of a breath. Door. Reagan was already at the hinge with the tool. 30 seconds, Holt confirmed. "I'll have the door," Reagan said. Holt went back up the platform. He came through the window, feet first, slowly controlling the entry with both hands on the frame until his weight was fully inside and his boots were on the floor. Then he was standing on the second floor of a building on Millhaven Road, old plank flooring under his boots, the work light throwing hard shadows, dust in the air. 2 seconds of that. Then the man with the phone turned. What happened in the next 30 seconds was not something Holt would describe in detail later. Not because he couldn't account for it, but because the account of it would not be the most useful version of the story, and Holt had long since learned to distinguish between those two things. The useful version was this. Two men who had not expected anyone to come through a second-floor window found themselves at a significant disadvantage when confronted with a man who had been in burning buildings and other situations worse than this one, moving with the economical intention of someone who had a clear objective and had stopped being interested in anything that wasn't the objective. Reagan came through the door at 28 seconds. By 30, the room had been reorganized. The man who had been on the phone was on the floor. The other man was against the wall. Reagan had secured both of them with zip ties from his jacket pocket, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before in rooms he would never be more specific about, and then stepped back and let Holt have the room. Holt was at June's corner. He cut the zip ties on her wrists with his knife. He removed the gag the rest of the way. He put both hands on her shoulders carefully and looked at her face. "Della's safe," he said. "She's at Harlan's. She's fine." June Cross looked at him for the seconds it took for that information to travel through the terror and the adrenaline and land in the place where it meant what it meant. And then she exhaled a full, shuddering release of breath that she had apparently been holding in some form since 11:30 this morning, and she closed her eyes and stayed there long enough for the information to travel all the way down through everything she'd been carrying and mean what it meant. "Roy," she said. Her voice was raw from the gag from the hours. "Where is he?" "He handed you off," Holt said. "He's gone." He watched her face process that. "He drove you here and left." "He drove me here, and there was another man waiting." She said it with a flatness that was worse than crying. "Roy got back in my car and left. They told me." She stopped. She opened her eyes and looked at Holt directly. "They told me Roy arranged this months ago, that I wasn't the first one he brought them." The room was very quiet. Reagan looked up from the two men on the floor. "How many?" Holt said. He kept his voice level. It cost him something. "They didn't say a number," June said. "But the way they said it, not the first, the way they said it, it wasn't 2 or 3. Holt stood up. He looked at Reagan. Reagan looked back at him. In 6 years of road together, they had been in a number of rooms that asked difficult things of them. And in each of those rooms, there had been a moment like this one, a moment where the map of what was happening expanded suddenly to a scale they hadn't anticipated. And the question was whether that larger scale made you smaller or made you something else. He crouched down in front of the man who had been facing June's corner, the one who had been explaining the process in that administrative tone. The man was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone calculating his remaining options and finding them limited. "Who do you work for?" Holt said. The man said nothing. Holt said it again quietly with a quality of quiet that was not the absence of force, but its deliberate, controlled containment. The man looked at him. His face was doing the calculation, measuring the threat in front of him against the threat behind him, deciding which one was larger. "You want to think carefully about which one you're more afraid of," Holt said, "because I'm in this room with you right now, and the people you work for are not." A beat. "Aldrich," the man said. The word came out like he'd cut it out of himself. "Warren Aldrich, regional coordinator. He runs 8 properties across 4 counties. This is one of them." "Where is he?" "I don't know where he physically is. I get instructions through a relay. I don't have direct contact." "Roy Dent," Holt said. "Where did he go?" The man's face changed. A small change, something tightening around the eyes. Reagan caught it from across the room. Holt felt it. "Dent has a separate arrangement," the man said carefully. What kind of arrangement? Silence. Last time, Holt said. He brings them in, the man said. He finds them himself. They're already in his orbit, already isolated, already scared. He finds them, and he delivers them, and he gets paid per delivery, and he goes back and finds the next one. He said it with the flat inflection of someone reciting a business model they had stopped having feelings about. He's been doing it for 3 years. He's effective because he looks like a domestic problem rather than a trafficking problem. Law enforcement looks at him and sees a bad boyfriend. They don't look for the network behind him. 3 years. How many women, Holt said. The man on the floor looked at the ceiling. How many women, Holt said again, the same voice, the same contained quiet. 14, the man said. That I know of, from this region. The number landed in the room and the room changed around it. Reagan went very still. June behind Holt made a sound that was small and involuntary, and immediately suppressed the sound of someone absorbing something they had suspected and had hoped they were wrong about. 14 women, 3 years. Roy Dent, who had driven June Cross to this property and gotten back in her car, and driven away to go be a man with a domestic problem somewhere else. Holt stood up. He looked at Reagan. He looked at the two men on the floor. He looked at June. Call Ada, he said to Reagan. Now, all of it. These two, this location, what he just said, everything. Reagan already had his phone out. He looked at June. Can you stand? She proved it by standing immediately, which told him something significant about her. We're getting you out. Then Ada is going to need you to tell her everything, every word they said to you from the moment you arrived, everyone who came and went, anything you saw. Everything. June looked at him with an expression that had passed through gratitude and come out somewhere more complicated on the other side. Okay, she said, the word of someone who has decided what they are doing and doesn't need more time with it. They were moving toward the stairwell when Holt's phone vibrated. He looked at it. Not Ada, not Briggs, not Levi. The same unknown number as before. Don't leave yet. Check the outbuilding with the new roof. Northeast corner floorboard. There's a lockbox. Serial numbers, dates, names. You need it. Walsh needs it. He read it twice. He showed it to Reagan. Reagan read it. Someone's watching this property right now, Reagan said. Or they were here before us and left something. Same question either way, Holt said. He looked at June. 2 minutes. She had read the phone over his arm. She looked at him. What's in the outbuilding? Evidence, he said. She looked at him with those clear, functional eyes that had been through everything this day had held and were still operational. Then go, she said. I'll wait 2 minutes. He crossed the gravel yard to the outbuilding with the new metal roof. Door unlocked. Inside cold metal, old wood, something faintly chemical underneath. He went to the northeast corner, found the floorboard by the way the nailhead sat differently from the others, the slight disturbance in the old dust. He pulled it up. A waterproof lockbox hardware store variety combination lock. He tried the obvious sequences. Nothing. Then he picked it up and turned it over and found what he was looking for on the bottom 4 digits, scratched into the metal with something sharp and fine, barely visible, the kind of mark you made when you wanted the information to be findable but not obvious. He tried it. The box opened. Inside a USB drive, a folded piece of paper, a photograph. He unfolded the paper first. A handwritten list, names and dates and 3-digit codes running down the page in 2 columns. 14 entries. The oldest dated 3 years back. He recognized 2 of the names women he knew had been listed as missing persons in the county database, because Ada had mentioned them once obliquely in the way law enforcement mentioned cases that didn't close and didn't stop weighing on them. He looked at the photograph. Surveillance image taken from distance, slightly grainy, the compression of a long lens. A property, a building. A man standing at a vehicle face, in enough focus to be identifiable. Not Roy Dent, not anyone Holt recognized. But in the lower right corner, in the same handwriting as the list, 3 things: a name, an address, and 2 words. He's there. The address was not in Black Hollow, not in this county, 40 miles east in a town called Durant. And the building in the photograph had a sign above its door, partially visible in the frame, enough letters to read as the edge of something institutional, something official. Holt looked at it for a long moment. Then he put the USB drive and the list and the photograph back in the box and closed it and took it with him. He crossed the yard. Reagan was at the door with June. They looked at him and read his face, and neither of them asked because his face was already saying something that didn't need to be spoken to fill the space between them. "Ada," he said to Reagan, "2 minutes out. I can hear sirens." Holt could hear them now too distant coming in from the south on Millhaven Road. The sound of official response arriving at the speed of official response, which was the speed of warrants and procedures, and a system doing exactly what it was designed to do in exactly the order it was designed to do it. He looked at the lockbox in his hand. "This goes to Ada," he said. "All of it, the box, what those two said upstairs, the location, the documentation." He looked at Reagan, "But not the photograph." Reagan looked at him steadily. "Why not the photograph?" "Because the address on it is in Durant. Durant is a different county with a different sheriff's office, and the building in that photograph has the edge of an official sign above its door." He held Reagan's gaze. "And I don't know yet which side of the system the person who built that evidence box is on, which means I don't know which side of the system the person in that photograph might be connected to. Which means if that photograph goes into a chain of custody that includes the wrong person, the chain breaks," Reagan said. "Or something worse," Holt said. Reagan looked at him for a long moment. "You know what this means, following that photograph." "Yeah," Holt said. "I know what it means. 40 miles into a county they didn't know, after a man they couldn't identify, who appeared to be connected to an official institution they couldn't name yet." "Holt," Reagan said, "his name with the weight of someone who had been saying a particular person's name long enough to know all the things it could carry. When you went into that burning building 18 years ago and didn't come back out with everyone you went in for, that was not your fault. I've never said that to you because you have never let me close enough to say it. I'm saying it now because you are about to make a decision that will either cost you everything or cost someone else everything, and I need you to make it for the right reason. Not because you've been carrying a dead man's weight for 18 years, and this feels like the way to put it down." The sirens were close now. Ada would be through the gate in under a minute. Holt looked at Reagan, at the man with the scar from below his ear to his collar from a room he'd never fully described, who kept zip ties and a hinge pin puller in his jacket and his boots on a routine morning, and who had said, "I've done that before. I know what it costs in a diner booth," without specifying what the work was or where the cost had been paid. "Is this the right reason?" Holt said. "Only you know that," Reagan said. The gravel crunched at the gate. Ada's cruiser coming in fast headlights, cutting through the failing afternoon light. Delgado's vehicle right behind. Holt handed the lockbox to Reagan. He kept the photograph, folded it into his jacket pocket alongside the rabbit, against his chest. Ada came across the yard at a controlled run, and he met her halfway and began telling her what they'd found the two men upstairs, where to look in the main building, what to document and in what order. The van, the attachment points, the company name, the shell company chain, all of it delivered in the clean sequential order of someone who understood what a law enforcement officer needed and in what sequence she needed it. Ada listened with the focused economy of a deputy who had already made the calls that were going to change the shape of this day and was now receiving the evidence that would support them. When he finished, she looked at him the way people looked at Holt Kane when they had just received more information than they expected from the source they were receiving it from and were deciding what to do with that gap. "The box," she said. "Outbuilding, northeast corner floorboard." Reagan handed it to her. "We didn't open it." She looked at the box. She looked at Holt. "Someone left it." "Someone left it," Holt confirmed. "For me, seems like." Ada held his gaze with the expression of a law enforcement officer standing at the exact boundary of what she could ask and what she could use, deciding which side of that line she was on. Then she stepped aside. June Cross needs medical attention, Holt said, and her daughter needs to see her face. Go, Ada said, the single word of a woman who had already made her decision. The drive back to Harlan's in the failing afternoon light was the quietest Holt had been in hours. Briggs and Levi fell in behind on the road they'd gotten the story in 2 sentences at the gate, and the 4 bikes moved through the gray November landscape in the formation they always held, and Holt rode with the photograph against his chest and the rabbit against his ribs and the weight of 14 names on a handwritten list. At Harlan's, when the door opened and Della saw her mother come through it, she left the back booth so fast she knocked the card game off the table, and June went to her knees on the diner floor and caught her daughter, and the sound of it, the sound of a mother holding a child. She had spent 6 hours not knowing if she would get to hold again was a sound that Holt turned away from. Not because it was painful, because it was complete, and completeness in that form belonged only to the people inside it. He went to the counter. He stood with his back to the room, both hands flat on the countertop, and he breathed. Willa set a coffee in front of him without being asked. He stood there with his hands around the mug and the weight of the day pressing down and the photograph in his jacket. Levi came up beside him, stood there, said nothing. 14, Holt said quietly. Levi was quiet for a moment. I heard you talking to Ada. 14 names on that list. 3 years. And the man who coordinated all of it is 40 miles east at an address connected to county law enforcement offices. Holt turned the coffee mug in his hands. And I don't know what the sign above that door says. Not yet. Levi was quiet. Behind them, the diner held its warmth and its light. And in the back booth, June Cross was holding her daughter with the grip of someone who had spent 6 hours not knowing if she would get to do this again. The cards from the Go Fish game were scattered on the floor. The jukebox hummed its faint, purposeless hum. His phone lit up on the counter. The unknown number. One final time. You found it. Good. His name is Warren Aldrich, Regional Coordinator. The address is a private consulting firm, Graywall Consulting Group, LLC, that operates as a security contractor for 3 county sheriff's offices in this region. He has law enforcement relationships in 2 counties that predate the operation by a decade. He read it, then the next message arriving 30 seconds later. This is why the missing persons cases don't close. This is why the women don't come home. You now have everything I can give you. The rest is yours. And then after a pause long enough that he thought the messages were done. My name was on that list. 3 years ago I got away. Most of them didn't. Do what I couldn't. Holt read it 3 times. He set the phone down. He looked at Reagan, who had come up on his other side at some point and had been reading over his shoulder. The diner was warm. The coffee was hot. Behind them, a mother was holding her daughter on the floor. And 40 miles east in the town of Durant, a man named Warren Aldrich was at an address connected to 3 county sheriff's offices, connected to law enforcement relationships that had kept 14 names off the active investigation list for 3 years. A man who had built his network not in spite of the system, but inside it, using the system's architecture to support his own, the way a parasite uses a host skeleton. Holt picked up his coffee, drank the last of it in one swallow, set the mug down on the counter with the finality of a man who has finished the last warm thing he is going to have for a while. He turned around. Reagan had his cut off the hook before Holt finished looking at them. Briggs didn't reach for his gloves, they were already on. Levi stood at the door like he'd been waiting for the question to be answered. None of them spoke. The answer had already been given. Holt looked across the diner at June and Della still on the floor. Della's face buried against her mother's shoulder. June's arms around her daughter with the grip of someone who had spent the last 6 hours not knowing if she'd get to do this again and was not yet ready to let go of the fact that she had. He looked at them long enough to fix it the specific image of a mother holding a daughter on a diner floor on a November evening, and then he looked away. Then he looked at Willa. Ada's coming here. Keep them here until she arrives. Willa looked at him. Where are you going? He pulled on his cut. East, he said. He didn't look at June again. He didn't trust what his face would do. The four bikes hit Route 9 at 40 minutes past 5, running east into a darkness that had come down hard and complete, the kind of November night that absorbed headlights at the edges and gave nothing back. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees and the wind was coming in off the flat land in sustained gusts that hit from the left and pushed at you steadily, the kind of wind that didn't gust and release, but simply leaned against you without rest. 40 miles, 41 minutes at this pace. In his chest pocket, the photograph and the rabbit, the name Warren Aldrich and the address and the two words written in a corner. He's there. Written by a woman who had been number 3 on a list of 14 who had spent 3 years trying to put together the thing that would make someone with reach and nothing left to lose finally go look at the thing the system had been carefully not looking at. Do what I couldn't. He thought about Warren Aldrich as he rode. Not dent was a delivery mechanism, a tool, a replaceable part. Aldrich was the machine itself, a man with a decade of law enforcement relationships who had not built his operation in spite of those relationships, but through them in the gaps they created. In the places where knowing the right people meant certain reports got filed slowly, in certain cases got deprioritized, and certain patterns went unconnected in databases that should have connected them years ago. That was the thing that made Holt's hands tighten on the bars in the dark. Not Dent. Dent was simply a man who had found a way to turn his worst qualities into a transaction. Aldrich was the infrastructure that made the transaction possible, repeatable, and invisible. At mile 30, Reagan pulled level with him on the empty highway, looked at him from behind the visor, made the hand signal flat horizontal that in their shared vocabulary meant pace yourself. What's the plan? Holt pointed forward, then made the other signal 2 fingers circling motion. We look first. Reagan dropped back. They took the Durant exit at 40 past 6. The town was small, smaller than Black Hollow. The kind of small where every building was known to everyone who lived there, which meant the address on the photograph was findable by anyone who knew to look. They rode the main street slowly. A hardware store, a diner, a county annex, a bank. Then 1 block east off the main street, Holt saw it. Low brick building. The sign above the door that had been partially visible in the photograph was now fully legible. Graywall Consulting Group, LLC. Lights on inside. 2 vehicles in the small lot, a black pickup and a silver SUV. Movement visible behind the frosted glass of the front office. Someone moving around in there and moving with the focused directional purpose of someone who was not working late but managing something urgent. Holt pulled into the hardware store lot across the street, engine off. The others parked beside him. They sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, the cold pressing in immediately with the engines gone. 2 vehicles, Briggs said. Could be more people inside. Building has county contracts, Reagan said. There may be staff in there who have no idea what Aldrich is. People who answer phones, process paperwork. Ordinary employees. Holt was looking at the building, specifically at the angle of the photograph, the way it had been shot, the direction of the light in it, the partial sign visible at the top of the frame. He looked at the east side of the building, a service entrance. The photograph had been taken from close from the east from near that entrance. Someone had been at that door when they took it. Someone was inside that building when they took this photograph, he said, and came out the back to take it. He looked at Reagan. Someone inside that building has been building a case from inside it. For a long time. His phone lit up. The unknown number 1 more time. He's shredding. He got a call. Someone from Millhaven warned him the property was hit. He knows. He's destroying financial records in the server room right now. If those records go, the money trail goes. Without the money trail, 2 men giving a name is 2 men giving a name and nothing underneath it. Then the back door is unlocked. I unlocked it 40 minutes ago. I've been waiting. He showed Reagan the screen. Reagan read it. His jaw was tight. The scar on his face pulled the way it did when he was holding something in a place that cost him effort to hold it. If we go through that back door, Reagan said carefully, we are going into a building with county government contracts to stop a man from destroying evidence. That is breaking and entering interference with, yeah, Holt said. And if we don't go. The wind leaned against them from the left. 14 degrees. The lights in the front office of Graywall Consulting Group moved again. Someone moving fast, the shadow crossing and recrossing the frosted glass with the urgency of someone working against a clock they'd set themselves. 14 names, Briggs said quietly. Nobody answered that. Nobody needed to. Holt got off his bike. He crossed the street at a walk, not running, not hurried. The deliberate pace of a man who has decided on a thing and is past the point where urgency means anything. Reagan was a step behind him. Briggs moved east toward the service entrance. Levi stayed with the bikes and the sightlines on the front. The service entrance door opened with 2 fingers, unlocked as promised. Holt stepped into the back corridor of Graywall Consulting Group, and the warmth of the building came at him after 40 miles of cold, the institutional warmth of a place that ran its heat through empty corridors and didn't know or care who was in them. Fluorescent lights, linoleum, a water cooler, a fire exit sign at the far end of the hall, and from the left, mechanical, rhythmic, continuous, the specific sound of a commercial document shredder running without stopping. Second door on the left, wire glass panel in the door. Through it, blinking server rack indicator lights, and a man at a desk feeding documents into a commercial shredder with the focused, methodical urgency of someone who had completed his risk calculation hours ago and was now executing the results. Warren Aldrich was 62 years old and looked like what he was, a bureaucrat, a systems man 4 decades inside institutions and their processes. Compact and gray-haired, entirely unremarkable in the way of people who have learned that unremarkability is its own form of protection. He was feeding the shredder with the concentration of someone who understood that the next 30 minutes were the most consequential 30 minutes of his professional life. He didn't hear the door over the shredder. He heard Holt's boots on the floor. He looked up. For one long, specific moment, the 2 men looked at each other through the warm, institutional light of the server room. And what passed between them in that moment was the recognition of 2 people who have just understood that the architecture each of them believed in has been exposed to the other as exactly what it was. Aldrich's hand moved toward the desk drawer. Holt crossed the room in 3 steps and caught the wrist before it arrived. The shredder jammed on the last document he'd fed into it and stopped. The mechanical silence after was complete and absolute. Aldrich looked at the hand on his wrist. He was breathing hard. His face was doing the calculation, measuring options, finding them limited. The same calculation Holt had seen on the face of the man on the floor at Millhaven. The same result. "You have no authority here," Aldrich said. His voice was steady. Even now, with Holt's hand on his wrist, in the server room humming around him, and the shredder jammed and silent, the voice was steady. The voice of a man who confused the institutions he'd used with the authority he'd never actually earned. "No," Holt said. "I don't. Whatever you think you're doing." "The 2 men from Millhaven Road are in custody," Holt said. "They've been talking. The lockbox from the Northeast outbuilding is in the hands of a deputy who is currently on the phone with the state." He looked at the monitor on the desk, still running a file transfer interrupted mid-process. "And whatever's on that server exists whether you finish shredding or not. Because someone in this building has been copying it for longer than you've known there was a problem." Aldrich's face changed. A small, specific change, something shifting behind the eyes. "Who?" he said. "You know who?" Holt said. A sound from the hallway. Reagan at the doorway, one hand on the frame, watching the corridor. Briggs coming in behind, taking the corner of the room reorganizing itself around Warren Aldrich without him understanding when it had happened or how. Aldrich looked at the men around him. He looked at Holt. He looked at the shredder with its last document jammed in its teeth. "You're bikers," he said, the word carrying the weight of a man reaching for the last leverage he has, the social architecture he had always relied on, the way the system categorized men like these, the assumptions that had always worked in his favor. "Whatever you think you found, when this gets to a courtroom, the first thing they'll see is what you are." Holt looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "They'll see what we are." He released Aldrich's wrist. He took a step back. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed the photograph on the desk between them. The surveillance image, taken from close from the east from the service entrance of this building by someone who had been inside it and had come out the back and pointed a camera at a man who believed he was invisible. Aldrich looked at the photograph. The color left his face the way color leaves the faces of people who have just understood that something they believed was private has not been private for a very long time. Someone has been watching you from inside your own building, Holt said, long enough to document everything, long enough to know that doing it alone wasn't going to be enough. He held Aldrich's eyes without looking away. But we're not alone, and neither is she. Aldrich's mouth opened, started something, stopped. Footsteps in the corridor behind Reagan. Reagan stepped aside. A figure appeared in the doorway, and Holt looked at her and understood completely finally the full shape of everything he had been handed across this long day. She was around 30, with the physical economy of someone who had spent a long time learning to take up as little space as possible, and had been carefully, deliberately unlearning it. She was carrying a laptop and an external hard drive, and she was looking at Warren Aldrich with the eyes of a woman who had been building toward this specific moment for 3 years and had arrived at it still standing. "My name," she said, "was on your list." Aldrich said nothing. "Number 3, she said, 3 years ago." She looked at Holt. "I copied everything. Every transaction, every communication, every property record across all 8 locations. It's on this drive and it's already been transmitted to a federal contact who is not in your network, who has never been in your network, and who has been waiting for this specific package since last spring." She set the laptop on the desk beside the photograph. "You're done," she said. The shredder sat silent with its last document caught in its teeth. The server room hummed around them, patient and indifferent, holding in its drives everything that Warren Aldrich had spent 3 years building inside the architecture of legitimacy. All of it about to become the thing that unmade him. Reagan secured Aldrich's wrist with the efficiency of a man who had done this in rooms that predated this one by years he didn't talk about. Aldrich went to the floor, and Briggs put a knee in the center of his back with the patient, immovable weight of a man who had held things in place before and was prepared to do it as long as required. The woman's name was Nava Wren. She said it with the intention of someone who has had to reclaim a name and does not say it casually. While Aldrich was on the floor, she made the call she'd been waiting to make for 18 months. Not Ada, not anyone in the county network. A federal contact she'd identified and cultivated through 2 years of careful, invisible work while sitting at a desk 40 feet down the corridor from the man responsible for 14 names on a handwritten list. The federal response took 40 minutes. 2 agents, unmarked vehicle, the movement of people who exist inside systems without disturbing their surfaces. They assessed the room efficiently and without visible surprise. One of them looked at Holt. "Vance Kane," Holt said. "Walsh briefed us." A pause doing specific work. "You're going to have a long few days of statements." "I know. Tonight go back to Black Hollow. We'll come to you." He looked at Aldrich on the floor, then back at Holt. "The drive is clean. The testimony from Mill Haven is clean. The chain from the lockbox is intact." He held Holt's gaze for a moment. "What happened in this room tonight is complicated, but we're going to call it an unfortunate exercise of citizen intervention in an ongoing federal matter, and we're going to say it exactly once." Holt nodded. They left Aldrich on the floor and they left Neva in the chair, and as Holt reached the door, she looked up and he looked back at her, and there was a moment between them that had no adequate words. The exchange between 2 people who have arrived at the same point from completely different directions and understand each other's journey without requiring the other to explain it. "The other names," he said. "The ones who didn't. The federal contact has everything," she said. "Every name, every date. They'll work backward from the records." She held his gaze. "It won't bring them home, but it won't stay dark either." He nodded. He went through the door. The ride back to Black Hollow was the longest 40 miles Holt had ridden in 6 years of road. The cold was the same cold, the dark, the same dark, the wind still coming in from the left without rest. But the quality of it had changed the way the quality of everything changes after the thing you have been moving toward has been arrived at. Not lighter exactly, more like settled. The way a structure settles when the load-bearing work is done and the weight finds its final resting place. He rode and he felt the burn scar and he felt the cold and he felt the rabbit against his ribs and he let himself feel all of it without managing it toward anything in particular. They got back to Black Hollow at midnight. Harlan's was still lit warm yellow light in the windows, Ada's cruiser in the lot, and through the glass, Holt could see the diner occupied with more people than it had held all day. He pulled in and killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Then he went inside. June and Della were in the back booth. Ada was across from them, notepad on the table but closed pen down. Not an interview anymore, something else. The warmth of people who have been through something together and have ended up in a lit room with coffee and are letting that be enough for right now. Willa was behind the counter, and at the far end of the counter, a woman Holt didn't recognize, late 40s, bone-tired in the way that lived below the surface, watching the room with eyes that had been waiting a long time. Ada looked up when the four of them came in. Something moved across her face. Relief was part of it, with significant reservations attached. "Federal called me 20 minutes ago," she said. "Good," Holt said. "You want to tell me what happened in Durant?" "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll tell you everything tomorrow." He stopped. He looked at the booth. Della had seen him. She was already sliding out of the seat. She crossed the diner without hesitation and stopped in front of him and looked up and held out her hand. In her palm, the stuffed rabbit. She had apparently retrieved it from his jacket at some point, while his back was turned with the quiet precision of a child who had learned to take careful actions in careful moments. He looked at it. "You don't want it back." "I want you to have it," she said, with the certainty of someone who has thought this through completely and is not uncertain about any part of it. "So I remember," he said. She looked up at him with 8 years of very specific knowledge in her face. "So you remember that you're the kind of person who comes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He took the rabbit, he put it back in his inside pocket against his chest, and he felt the small accumulated weight of it, a child's most important object given deliberately, and he let it be exactly what it was. June was at the edge of the booth. She looked at Holt with the face of someone who had been through everything this day had held and was still upright and was not going to apologize for either the things that had happened to her or the things she had done to survive them. She had Della's hand in hers. "Thank you," she said, not dressed up, not extended, just the two words carrying exactly what they needed to carry. "You sent her to find us," Holt said. "You knew what to do." "I didn't know it would be you," she said. "Does it matter?" She looked at him for a moment with something complicated and honest and not yet resolved. "No," she said. "I guess it doesn't." The woman at the counter turned on her stool. Holt looked at her and she looked at him and she said quietly, "My daughter was number 9 on that list. She went missing 14 months ago." She said it the way people say things they have been carrying so long the weight has become part of their posture. "Walsh called me an hour ago. She said there was going to be a real investigation." The woman stopped. She looked at the counter for a moment and then back up at him. "I don't know if that means she's—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "But I'll know." Walsh said, "I'll know." Holt had nothing adequate to give her, and he knew it. He looked at her and held the inadequacy of it without trying to cover it with words that would only make it smaller. "Yeah," he said. "You'll know." She nodded once and turned back to her coffee. Willa brought cups to the counter without being asked. The four of them settled onto the stools. Ada sat at the end. They drank their coffee and said almost nothing, and the almost nothing was exactly the right amount. Around 2 in the morning, Della fell asleep against her mother's side in the back booth. The deep, absolute sleep of a child whose body has finally decided the threat level has dropped below the threshold that required consciousness to manage. June sat with her daughter's weight against her, and her coffee going cold, and her eyes moving between the booth and the counter and the 4 men at it. And there was something in the way she watched them that had passed through gratitude and come out somewhere quieter on the other side. Something more permanent. The look of a woman who understood what she had witnessed and was deciding what to do with that understanding. Around 3, Levi said very quietly, "We riding out tomorrow?" Holt turned the question in his hands. The way you turn something you've been carrying and are finally looking at directly. "Yeah," he said. Levi nodded. Briggs said nothing. Reagan looked into his coffee cup. "Holt," Reagan said. "Yeah. That building tonight. The window you came through." He didn't look up from the cup. "That was the first time in 6 years I've seen you go in instead of out." Holt sat with that for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Reagan looked up. The scar on his face was very visible in the warm diner light, and his eyes had 6 years of road in them, and something underneath all of that, which was older and more specific, and had never been fully spoken until tonight on the shoulder of Millhaven Road. "Good," Reagan said. "That was all. That was enough." At 3:30, when Ada had finally gone, and Willa had dozed off in the chair by the register, and June had carefully shifted so that Della's head rested in her lap along the full length of the back booth, Holt stepped outside. The cold hit him clean and immediate. 14 degrees, no wind now, the November night having settled into the stillness that comes in the hours before dawn when the world has run out of the energy to be turbulent. The parking lot held 4 motorcycles and the pale silver light of a sky full of stars that Black Hollow could see clearly because it had never been large or bright enough to wash them out. He stood in the cold with his hands at his sides, and he breathed in and out the vapor of it rising and dispersing in the still air. He thought about a building on fire, a face in a second-floor window. He thought about what it had felt like to carry that for 18 years, not the guilt exactly, more like the weight of a thing he'd never let himself put down because putting it down felt like deciding it didn't matter. And the only thing worse than carrying it was deciding it didn't matter. He thought about Reagan's words on the shoulder of Millhaven Road. "That was not your fault." And about Della's hand on his burn scar, small fingers surprising. Grip the hold of a child who has learned that grip is how you keep things from leaving before you finish with them. He thought about a woman named Neva Wren who had sat 40 feet from Warren Aldrich for 3 years and had built piece by piece the thing that finally made it possible for someone to come in from the outside and finish it. Do what I couldn't. He reached into his inside pocket. He felt the rabbit. The photograph was in Ada's hands now. Everything was in the right hands now, working through the right systems. Aldrich in federal custody, the financial records intact, the 14 names being worked backward through evidence that had been years in the making. Not all the way home, some of them. He knew that. Some of those names were going to resolve into answers that nobody wanted. But into light at minimum, into the record, into the territory where the truth of what happened to them existed in a form that the world could not simply decline to acknowledge. He stood in the cold, and he let himself feel the weight of that. Not resolution, he knew better than to call it resolution. More like the thing that happens when you have been carrying something in one particular way for a very long time, and you discover that carrying it differently is sometimes the only transformation available. Not lighter, not healed, just oriented differently, the weight distributed across different surfaces, the thing still present but no longer running you. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's what forward looks like. The diner door opened behind him. Levi came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Holt without a word and stood beside him. Then Reagan, then Briggs. The 4 of them in the parking lot in the November cold, with their coffee and their cuts and their specific accumulated silences, and the stars over Black Hollow, holding their positions the way they always did. Indifferent, patient, and somehow by virtue of their consistency, which was not warmth, but was the thing that made warmth possible enough. They stood there for a long time without speaking, because everything that needed to be said had been said somewhere in the hours behind them. And what was left was just this 4 men standing in a parking lot in the dark before dawn, holding coffee that was going cold, watching a sky that was showing the first almost imperceptible lightning on the eastern horizon. Not dawn yet, just the universe making a preliminary suggestion. Holt thought about 18 years. He thought about roads and distance and the arithmetic of moving. He thought about what it meant to have been in motion that long and to have found not a destination, not an arrival, but a single night that asked something of him, He'd been trying not to be asked, and had answered it anyway, and had not fallen apart in the answering. He thought about what Della had said. You're the kind of person who comes. Not you were once, not you used to be before. Just the present tense of it, flat and certain, like she'd been watching him long enough to know something about him that he'd been trying not to know about himself. He reached into his pocket, felt the rabbit, the small, specific weight of it. He thought about the face in the window 18 years ago. He thought about it the way he had thousands of times, but differently this time, not as accusation, not as debt, but as fact. A fact that had shaped him. A fact that had sent him into 18 years of motion into leather and road, and the Iron Compass chapter that rode nowhere and was fine with that. A fact that had ultimately been part of what had put him in that booth at 7:42 on a November night when a girl in wet sneakers walked through a storm to find someone who already knew how bad things could get. He couldn't unknow the face in the window. He didn't want to. It was part of the architecture of him built into his tissue, the same way the burn scar was built into his forearm. Not something to be removed, just something to be carried differently. He was aware of Reagan beside him. Reagan, who had said that was not your fault on the shoulder of Millhaven Road with the sirens coming and the afternoon going gray, and had then stepped back and given Holt the space to make his own decision without the weight of the absolution attached to it. That was the thing about Reagan. He understood the difference between offering something and insisting on it. You going to be all right? Levi said. Not to anyone specific, to the group. The question that was really just a way of saying we're still here. We're always all right, Holt said. But he said it differently than he usually did. Without the flatness, without the particular closed quality that the phrase usually had when it came out of him. He said it and meant something closer to the actual truth of it, which was that all right was a condition you arrived at incrementally by increments, and that tonight had moved the distance on it in a direction he was still calibrating. Briggs said nothing. Briggs communicated in presence and absence, in proximity and stillness, and right now he was communicating the former, which was enough. At 5 in the morning, the first gray light came up over the flat land east of town. Not dramatic, not the kind of dawn that announces itself. Just the gradual, patient return of color to things that had been dark, the diner sign, the gravel lot. The 4 motorcycles, the 4 men standing beside them, all of it becoming visible again in the growing light. Holt drank the last of his coffee. He set the cup on his bike's tank. He looked east where the light was coming from, where 40 miles away a server room held evidence that would take months to fully process and years to fully prosecute, and would bring 14 names out of the dark they'd been kept in. Not all of them would have come home. He knew that. He held that knowledge without trying to make it smaller or more manageable than it was. Some of those names were going to resolve into the worst kind of answer, but they would resolve. They would be in the record. They would exist in a form that the world could not simply choose not to acknowledge. That was not nothing. In the arithmetic of this particular night, that was not nothing at all. He put on his gloves. He started his bike. The other 3 started theirs, the staggered sequence of it, one after another, filling the empty morning lot with the sound Holt had been hearing for 6 years and had not once in those 6 years taken for granted. 4 machines that had been through the same roads, in the same weather, in the same decisions. The percussion of things that had been chosen and had kept choosing each other. The diner door opened one last time. Della stood in the doorway in the early gray light, her mother's hand on her shoulder, both of them watching. The rabbit was in Holt's pocket. The road was ahead of him. Black Hollow was already beginning to be behind him, in the way that towns become smaller the moment you begin to leave them. Not smaller in significance, just in scale, the way important things sometimes need distance to be seen in their full shape. He looked at her for a moment, at the 8-year-old girl who had run a mile and a half through a November storm to find someone who already knew how bad things could get, who had left her most important object on a porch railing so that the right person would find it and understand, who had looked at him across a diner and given him back something he hadn't known he was still capable of receiving. He gave her a nod. She gave him one back, small, complete, the same serious nod she'd given him last night when she went with the deputy. The nod of someone who has made their peace with the terms of a situation and is not looking for anything beyond what's been given. He put his helmet on. The four bikes pulled out of the lot and onto Route 9, and the light came up behind them as they rode east, then banked north, then found the highway that would carry them out of Black Hollow and into whatever came next. The light came up the way it always did in November, without drama, without announcement, just the patient return of visibility to a world that had been dark for a while and was ready now to be seen again. The road went where roads went, which was forward, which was the only direction that had ever been available to men like these. Not because the past wasn't real, not because the scars weren't permanent, not because the weight of the things they carried had been lifted or resolved or forgiven by any single night however long, but because the road didn't ask you to be whole. It only asked you to ride. And they did.